Welcome back to another explosive edition of Wednesday Night Razzle Dazzle. Now, it's been a good year and a half of the show, but some people keep saying things are getting a bit stale. Some people are saying it was never good in the first place. So to shake things up, you know what's going to happen? I'm going to do a heel turn. For tonight's main event, I'm calling you out, pile of games I grew up with. We're gonna figure out who lives up to the hype and who's just a jobber not worthy of a roster spot. All with the help of my tag team partner, Corkboard. Corkboard, get out here. Also, disclaimer, this is just a bunch of wrestling games I grew up with. I've played a lot of wrestling games, but by no means have I played all of them. So if I missed your favorite, I'm sorry, I probably just haven't played it before. And for the sake of keeping things interesting, we're going to be jumping around the timeline a little bit. Basically, that's to keep things from getting stale, so we're not sticking around the N64 or the GameCube or the Xbox for too long. But without any further ado, let's get ready to rumble.
I don't think I even knew what tights were until I picked up a copy of WCW vs NWO World Tour for the N64, and what a way to get into the world of sports entertainment. See, this was my first interaction with Aki's incredibly simple yet fun grappling engine. In order to do your variety of moves, you either tap the A button for a weak grapple or hold the A button for a strong one. And the same goes for the B button with strikes. That means your wrestlers can do a variety of moves without ever having to memorize long button combinations. And that allows for casual and seasoned players to pick it up and have fun together. In addition, World Tour brought about the Spirit Meter, which gauges momentum, and reaching special allows you to do your wrestler's finishing move. This was so much better than the life bars that came before in other games. Previously, you drained the life bar of your opponent and pinned them, making the games closer to arcade fighters. But with the Spirit Meter, matches can flow and momentum can shift as a previously beaten down wrestler starts to come back. This whole idea is one of the major keys that makes the Aki engine and the games that use it great. On World Tour's surface, it doesn't look like there's a lot to do once you reach the main menu. You have the WCW vs NWO mode where you choose a side and select wrestlers from your respective team to battle each other. It's a cool little enough novelty, especially with friends because you play with each wrestler until they lose, so when I chose Sting, he never lost. You also have a tournament mode, which is exactly what it sounds like, but the bread and butter hook, which I loved as a kid, was the League Challenge. You choose a wrestler and then battle your entire division for the belt or, cup in order to unlock more wrestlers. The cast of characters is pretty cool too, sporting more than 40 wrestlers to play as. Half of the roster is made up of the mainstay wrestlers like WCW's Sting, or NWO's Sting. But you also have a ton of made up independent wrestlers based off of other real life wrestlers around the world. But now we get to the downsides. While this game and its PS1 prequel of sorts, WCW vs. the World and Virtual Pro Wrestling that came before that, were great starts to a long lineage of excellent wrestling games, this game is just that, a start. World Tour is lacking a lot of the attitude and personality that WCW was known for at this point in time. There are only a handful of rings to wrestle in, 4 to be exact, and none of the wrestlers have entrances. Matches start in the ring. While each wrestler has a finisher, the animations rarely resemble the move they're supposed to be emulating. In addition, the character models and the faces in particular barely resemble the wrestlers outside of their attire. However, once you get going, you start to forget that Giant looks nothing like Giant, and you just start to have some fun, especially when you find out you can grab weapons from the crowd. Overall, WCW vs NWO World Tour is still very fun to play, even alone. I ended up recording about an hour and a half's worth of footage in one sitting for this video, which was far more than I was ever going to need. I just lost track of time. While plenty of better wrestling games came after it, this game drew the roadmap for all the Aki wrestling games on N64 that came after.
Even after all this time, World Tour offers quite a bit of fun. Sure, you'll find a lot of better wrestling games, but you'll also find a lot worse.
In today's time, there are a lot of feelings about the state of 2K's WWE games, and of course there are. You saw WWE 2K20. But back when I was working at GameStop, I was lucky enough to get a copy of WWE 2K16 for free, which was really exciting because at this point in time, I was years removed from my last real wrestling game. Once I popped it in, I was really excited about the Stone Cold Steve Austin story mode and the deep RPG elements of the career mode, where you take a brand new wrestler that you create and work your way up from the training center all the way up to WWE Champion, while balancing your image between the WWE Authority and the fans. The game valued the quality of matches over wins and losses, and you were given scenarios that made you choose over winning to appease your fans or losing to potentially get more opportunities from the Authority, which I thought was really incredible. This kind of background acknowledgement of kayfabe was really something totally new to me in video games and added a lot to the actual story mode. This entry was also free of the cancer that infects most games these days, 2K's virtual currency. But even though the game wasn't begging you for your money, VC was tough to grind out and added a lot of padding to try to get your wrestler competitive enough to control some of the main card matches. But even still, there are plenty of reasons to go back to this release. There's just so much to do and unlock. There are 120 wrestlers to play as, such as Sting, and you can create characters to your heart's content. I never got around to playing 2K15 or 17 that came after, so I can't really say which is the definitive 2K WWE game, but I still consider 2K16 a pretty good game that's worth hours of fun, especially when you find out you can pick it up for super cheap.
The Stone Cold Steve Austin career mode got me hooked, but the depth of the career mode kept me coming back long after I finished the showcase. While there is definitely a bit of a grind with this game, I'd still prefer it over the microtransaction-riddled hellscape that is the rest of the WWE series, starting with 2K18. As such, this game ranks pretty high on the list.
WCW NWO Revenge is still great thanks to the further tuning and refining of the Aki engine. This game followed up WCW vs NWO World Tour and fixed almost all the issues I had with that game in terms of presentation. Revenge added the personality that World Tour was sorely missing in the scope of the Monday Night Wars and gave a much more accurate, grittier feel to the game. Let me explain that a little better. World Tour was a game that emphasized the wrestling and the in-ring performances, which of course is massively important, but it wasn't indicative of the tone of WCW's wrestling scene at that point. Wrestlers in World Tour had generic finishers over their signature ones, no one had an entrance, the arenas were generic. Don't get me wrong, I still loved it at the time and I still think it's worth playing, at least from a historical perspective. But when you flick the N64 on and see gravestones catch fire and see Sting emerge from between them, it really gives that wild WCW feel from the months right before the company burned down. The wrestlers finally got their entrances and their finishers really looked like their finishers, not to mention they actually had faces that resembled theirs and better model geometry. Additionally, there were 5 pay-per-view arenas added to the game like Halloween Havoc and Starrcade and Bash at the Beach. All of these improvements added to the spectacle and showmanship of the WCW at the time. The only really lacking area of the presentation is the music. There are only a handful of tracks, likely a limitation of the N64 cartridge size, and it would have been cool to have actual wrestling entrance themes. Gameplay was tweaked and refined too, with new additions that help the game feel more true to WCW as well. You can bring managers out to the ring with you who can interfere with the match, and the crowd is more inclined to give you weapons like trophies and stop signs. Now the wrestlers in the ring can also string multiple reversals together and reverse their opponent's reversals as opposed to the single reversal system in World Tour. And while in real life the bloated roster of superstars harm WCW as a company, the game benefits from having a long list of wrestlers to choose from. There are 60 wrestlers in total to play as, including many all-time great superstars. You can let your imagination run wild with dream matches. And while you can't create your own wrestler if the game is missing one that you want to play as, you can for some reason edit each wrestler's attire. I can only imagine this was added to give you the option to dress your favorite wrestler up in NWO garb as the faction rapidly swallowed the entire locker room. In its defense, it gave you the option to keep wrestlers' attire current, as a serious issue with wrestling games all the time is usually their roster being out of date the moment they come out, so good on THQ for figuring that out early. Still, a create a wrestler mode would have been better. If this game had more game modes and specialty matches, I'd be hard-pressed not to put this at the top of the list, but it doesn't, unfortunately. There isn't much outside of standard matches. There are tag team matches, one-on-one matches, triple threat matches, and fatal four-ways. Outside of that, there are handicap matches and a battle royale, Royal Rumble type mode that has you facing off against other wrestlers trying to throw you over the top rope to eliminate you, which I spent a lot of time playing as a kid. The main source of fun in the single player is the championship mode where you partake in a tournament of wrestlers as you try to work your way toward the title belt. Once you beat the champion, you unlock the wrestler who held the title. It's not a bad mode, it just isn't super deep.
WCW vs NWO Revenge was Aki's curtain call for the WCW line of games on the N64, but by no means was this the last time we'll see the Aki engine. While the WWF adopted the engine later and added a bunch of things to make the games even better, this was a great way to go out for WCW games if we just ignore the rest of the games that came after. And as such, this garners a pretty high spot on this list.
As much as parents hate to admit it, video games can teach us a lot of important skills and lessons. A puzzle game can teach you logic skills, and a game as simple as Tetris can teach you spatial reasoning. WCW Nitro taught me one of these lessons as well, that video games could be fucking terrible. It was so bad we brought it back to the store. I thought I had a defective cartridge. Nope. Once we brought the second copy back home, I had the realization that maybe not every game with a Nintendo seal of approval was worth playing. But before we get to tearing this game apart, let's look at some of the upsides. Nitro features a pretty respectable list of wrestlers. It might seem small at first, but each time you beat the tournament mode with a wrestler, it unlocks a new one, bringing the final total of wrestlers to a lot, like 65. And each version of the game has different wrestlers to unlock depending on if you play on the N64 version, which came out way later. If you have the PS1 version, you're also treated to a bunch of FMV cutscenes at the beginning of the game, as well as these adorable little VHS dating profiles on the character select screen, with each superstar explaining why you should pick them.
This is why they call me the total package. Do you have the pain threshold to withstand the torture rack? Let's find out.
Yo, Chico, you selected Scott Hall? Get ready for a wild ride on the outside.
You also get to see some cool sizzle reels of the wrestlers you choose before the tournament starts, which I think is a nice touch. Of course, the N64 is missing all the FMV thanks to cartridge limitations, so don't expect all that if you find this cartridge in the dumpster or something. I don't know where else to put it, but look how sad Sting looks here. Is he blue that his face is red? But chances are you're never going to see this extensive list of wrestlers because the actual gameplay is some of the worst I've ever seen. There is a serious clash between the control inputs and the speed of the game. WCW Nitro's game speed is insane, some of the fastest moving gameplay I've ever seen on the N64, and that's not inherently bad, but the game requires you to put these complex button combinations in to complete moves.
Hey, Lico the Lotad, you want to play some WCW Nitro? It's exquisite. You want to see how to play it?
Sure.
Here's a 12-page manual on the move set. Now memorize it, because you can't play without it.
This is basically verifiable proof that a game this complex can't not be good, because like you have to study this, which proves that it's deep. It's got depth.
This style of moveset isn't inherently bad either. In fact, I would love to see a wrestling game that had similar inputs to a fighting game just to see what a good example of that is like. However, the game plays so fast that by the time you input some of these button combinations that require up to 4 different button inputs to do a single move, the computer has already launched its attack. If you let your guard down for even a second, it's over, unless you manage to call for interference for one of your faction members to attack the opponent, but even then, nothing is guaranteed. Look how quickly this match goes from start to finish. This footage is in real speed, it hasn't been sped up at all. Brutal to watch. And I can assure you I'm trying as hard as I possibly can to do a single move, and it's never given me one. On top of that, WCW Nitro is totally lacking in game modes. There is a single-player tournament, tag team tournaments for 1 or 2 players, and a fatal 4-way match that cuts the speed in half to account for how many wrestlers are on screen.
WCW Nitro is a hard sell. While it's got a pretty respectable roster of characters, especially from the time, the gameplay really takes the wind out of the sails of this game's title run. As such, this game scrapes the bottom of the list and is easily the least playable game that we'll cover today.
Oh my God! It's Smackdown versus Raw! Sports entertainment will never be the same!
Smackdown vs. Raw is probably one of my favorite series of all time, and while I played a lot of the console games that came out for it, I really got into the series when it came out on PSP from 2006 to 2011. So that's why later on you'll see some of the PSP footage. That's just the last copies I have. I played all of these games on PSP, and it's fantastic how good the developers did of adapting these console quality games to an on-the-go platform.
Up until the first SmackDown vs. Raw game, the brands had been split up between consoles. SmackDown represented the PlayStation and had a well-loved set of games. SmackDown 1 and 2 for PS1 were met with pretty positive acclaim, and the 3 games on PS2 were supposed to be incredibly good, with some fans saying Here Comes the Pain is one of the best wrestling games ever created. I never played these because I didn't have a PS2 until late last year, and hopefully soon I will. But on the Xbox side of things, we got the Raw series of games that consists of Raw 1 and 2, a couple of less beloved games. In addition, the Xbox received Wrestlemania 21, a game we'll be looking at in just a bit. I mostly missed out on the duo of Raw games. I played a bit of the first game, but it didn't really stand out among the rest, so I can't really talk much about it. But when the two brands SmackDown and Raw came together to duke it out in 2005, pro wrestling games changed forever. Once you turn on the game, you're greeted with,
Is this wrestling? Sure stinks like wrestling.
In SmackDown vs. Raw, or SmackDown vs. Raw 2005 as I'll be referring to it as, you have the option of playing a season mode where you take a wrestler through a series of branching storylines on the respective show that your wrestler is part of, meaning you'll have options and paths based on show bookings and other wrestlers on the roster you can compete against. It was incredible and as cheesy as you can imagine a WWE game would be during the Ruthless Aggression era, especially because this entry added full voice acting for the wrestlers during the season mode. The gameplay was adapted and improved from the SmackDown games before it, and it also added pre-match mini-games like the Stare Down and Test of Strength. It's not earth-shattering, but it does give a good feel to the beginning of matches instead of wrestlers just running at each other. Playing the game today actually still feels pretty good. It's approachable and fun and easy to pick up with a friend who has never played before. In fact, a few months before the pandemic, I brought my PS2 to a friend's house and we played all of the awesome gimmick matches like Hell in a Cell and the ladder matches for a really long time. Compared to later entries, it does feel a little bit dated and the wrestlers do feel a bit floaty, but it's more than playable. The roster, however, leaves a bit to be desired. While the number of wrestlers is a respectable 52, the superstars that make up the roster are a bit weak in my opinion. There are 2 Undertakers and 2 Kanes, both of which get a spot as a legend. It's really cool to see the classic tag team, the Road Warriors, in here though. You never see them, so this was a great addition. I'm not sure if the limited roster was a reflection of how few wrestlers were on staff at the time, or if it was due to the newly modeled characters that added more polygons to look more realistic and less blocky. I honestly think the visuals have aged pretty well, even with it being the first attempt at upgrading these models. But if you're dying to play as a certain wrestler in particular, you can always go and create your own to fill in the gaps using the surprisingly extensive Create a Wrestler mode. It's a bit clunky, but it's going to get the job done, especially since every little thing is customizable about your wrestler. To add to the custom creations you can make, there is also a pay-per-view mode where you can create your own pay-per-views with storylines and cutscenes. You basically get to make your own show. This is one of those modes that have come and gone throughout the years, but I've seen some really cool stuff done with it. Additionally, you have the Shop Zone, which allows you to purchase a variety of unlockables, from movesets to WWE Legends to... I feel like I've been added to a list just for seeing this. SmackDown vs. Raw 2005 began a new era of WWE video games, and what a start it was. In fact, my biggest qualm with the game is the cover art.
Why is Vince McMahon's face on the box? He's not even unlockable in this game. While SmackDown vs. Raw 2005 was the start to a new era, it took everything the other games before it learned and added it along with a bunch of new content to keep you busy for a pretty long time. It's still a fun game to play. Very few wrestling games can hold a candle to SmackDown vs. Raw 2006.
This was my first wrestling game after a long gap between WCW and NWO Revenge, and this game actually got me to start watching wrestling. It was due to a mix of the roster, the game modes, and the sheer amount of things to do and unlock. Almost everything from its predecessor was improved on. The gameplay was improved a bit, giving wrestlers more of an appropriate heft depending on their weight classes. There were new storylines in season mode, and fully animated cutscenes, a bigger roster with over 60 wrestlers, 3 of which are Hulk Hogan, a trophy case to display your achievements, and a game mode that took Smackdown vs. Raw to the next level. General Manager Mode. In General Manager Mode, Vince McMahon calls upon Eric Bischoff and Teddy Long to compete against each other to build up their respective brands in a sort of wager. The goal is simple: get more fans than the opposing show by the time WrestleMania rolls around. The leading brand between SmackDown and Raw wins and sees fame greater than your wildest dreams could work up. It's a trophy. The other is Fired. This mode is awesome if you like micromanagement sims where you have full control over everything. You have to draft a competent list of wrestlers, pair up different superstars to sustain rivalries, and build a brand that crushes the competition. I love being the general manager. It's a blast because you really have to plot out your show the best you can by listening to fan feedback, checking the headlines, stealing wrestlers from other shows if they aren't getting the opportunities they want, all while trying not to run out of money or injure your main characters by overworking them. You can even go into each match you book and play them in order to ensure the outcome that you want to progress your storylines and build heat. It's a simple system on the surface that involves a lot of strategy and thought, and I've also never beaten it. But even if you never touch General Manager Mode, you still have so much to see. Create a Wrestler Mode is back, and it's considerably more ironed out this time around. There are also way more options to choose from when creating the look of your character. Pay-per-view mode returns as well. I think the season mode in this entry is especially cool because you're presented with choices that determine how storylines play out way down the road. For instance, in the first few minutes of the SmackDown story mode, you have to accuse either John Cena or Rob Van Dam of hitting SmackDown's general manager with a car. If you choose Rob Van Dam, it doesn't seem like much happens at first, but later on it turns out accusing him sets him on the path to become WWE Champion, where he revives ECW before the WWE actually did so. The WWE shop returns, but the number of unlockables are a lot lower. You still have legends, legendary title belts, and alternative costumes for wrestlers to wear, but to be honest, it's a bit underwhelming compared to the sheer amount of unlockables from the previous game. But it's still something to work towards, so it's okay.
As I said earlier, nothing holds a candle to SmackDown vs. Raw 2006 in my opinion. There's just so much to do between the season mode and the pay-per-view mode and the GM mode. You're going to be playing this game for a really long time, and the roster is worth playing with. That's why SmackDown vs. Raw 2006 is going at the top of the list.
SmackDown vs. Raw 2007 was in a precarious position because it had to take the SmackDown vs. Raw series and adapt it to a wide variety of consoles, from the PSP to the Xbox 360. In this case, I'll be looking at the Xbox 360 version. The series had a lot to live up to with the jump to HD, and for the most part, I think it did a really good job. A new control scheme was brought in to better utilize the right stick. Now instead of doing directional inputs and pressing the grapple button, you could flick the right stick in a different direction to do different moves. It also brought out the strong grapple, a moveset that allows you to deal heavier damage to opponents that starts by getting them into a hold. It was a cool addition to the game that lets you carry your opponent around the ring and create a ton of memorable moments that were delegated to finishing moves prior. For instance, if there was a table in the ring, instead of having to save up a finisher, why not just pick them up and powerbomb them through it? Not all of it was perfect, like how Kane could get into chokeslam position whenever he wanted, even though that's his finisher, but that's more of a nitpick than anything. The strong grapples also enabled you to drag your opponent to specific contextual spots around the ring. You could take your opponent over to the steel steps and smash their head into them, or you could end their potential at reproduction by bouncing them on the ropes. One of the bigger additions to the game was the quote-unquote fight in the crowd. During specific match types, players could exit the ring and go to a predetermined area in the northeast corner of the arena to fight. This area was full of weapons, tables, and a raised platform to do aerial attacks from. You could also grab a bunch of randomized weapons from fans. It was a cool concept, but it got pretty stale once you realized that every single arena had the exact same layout. I wish there was a bit more randomness and surprise to it, but for what it was, it definitely spiced things up for a little while. Overall, the gameplay tweaks were really good and made sense for the leap to next-gen consoles. A lot of the specialty matches had extra gameplay elements that streamlined how things worked too, adding more engaging ways to end matches. Ladder matches especially were given special attention. Instead of just hoping your superstar grabs the belt and shakes it loose, you now have full control over grabbing it. Once the meter on the screen hits 0, the belt comes loose and the person holding it wins. There are also way more ways to prevent your opponents from draining the meter too. If you're in a pinch, you can lean a ladder against the one your opponent is standing on and run up it to create this wild moment to keep the match going. And that's just one example of a special mode that was given a new coat of paint. The tried and true season mode returns once again, but this time around I don't believe that the storylines are any of the best that the series has to offer. They run the gambit between boring stories where you get dragged into choosing a side between the little guy Chavo Guerrero and big guy Big Show for no reason, to completely ridiculous and weird storylines where your superstar gets magically changed into a woman and no one seems to notice or care and your moveset is reset to a terribly generic repertoire. And in some cases, the storyline branches off into a completely off-limits territory by today's standards, where Stephanie McMahon tries to end the exploitation of women on Raw and is made out to be the heel?
I've got nothing against a woman who wants to do a little house cleaning, but this is just wrong.
But then they take this creepy, ultra-conservative approach to it where Kurt Angle says that bikinis are un-American, so everyone looks terrible.
Let me tell you something, punk. Raw has always stood for real athletic wrestling. Tramps wiggling their fannies and falling out of bikinis, that's not wholesome. And it's not American.
No one hates people who exploit women like the WWE, and no one exploits women like the WWE. In the end, Stephanie McMahon ends up getting spanked by Trish Stratus, so I guess you can say we're all going to hell for watching this, thus concluding the worst 102 words I've ever voiceovered for this channel. While every game in this list makes you wrestle the same opponents repeatedly to progress the stories, as is the case with actual wrestling itself, I found myself saying, "I don't care," a lot of the time, which made the endless stream of 1v1 matches a slog to get through. I just don't feel compelled to see what happens next in a lot of these stories, which is really, really bad. Luckily, GM mode returns as well and is a bit more fleshed out with a variety of things to do in between shows. You can help build up stars 7 days a week as you get to manage how they spend their time. Additionally, you get to choose storylines that your wrestlers' rivalries are based off of, so you pit faces and heels against one another to create matches. It's a bit restrictive if you just want the simplicity of 2006's version of this, but overall I think this is a fun addition that helps players build stories that will last weeks and weeks until various pay-per-views.
Smackdown vs. Raw 2007 was a great first attempt at bringing the series to an HD console. However, the story mode that is what really kept me coming back was pretty lacking in my opinion. While there's still a ton to do, and there's a ton of gameplay tweaks that really build on the foundation of the series, I was pretty let down by the fact that the story mode was pretty weak. However, with the general manager mode returning and all of the customization options, you can still have a ton of fun with this game.
While Xbox and PS2 were duking it out with Smackdown and Raw, the GameCube was in a corner doing its own thing with narratively driven wrestling games Day of Reckoning 1 and 2. I can't do a deep dive and talk about either of these in the video because I don't have them anymore because I traded in Day of Reckoning 1 for store credit at GameStop about 10 years ago, but I remember having a great time with it. Well, luckily for me, I kept the game that had no worth. Wrestlemania 19. Do you love wrestling games but hate the squared circle? Well, damn it, I have a game for you. In Wrestlemania 19, you play as a disgraced superstar of your choosing and try to get revenge on Vince McMahon for throwing you out the door, literally. In order to do so, you have to murder a bunch of innocent people who are just trying to do their jobs by sending them brain first into the pit of misery. As a disgruntled employee, you're trying to destroy WWE's chances of putting on a successful WrestleMania by teaming up with Stephanie McMahon to destroy everything from the WWE's warehouses to its cargo ship to the shopping mall where the company is promoting the event. You know what they say, you can't hold WrestleMania if everyone who is supposed to set it up is dead and missing in a bottomless void. What really got me as a kid was the idea that something super different was going to happen in this wrestling game, but it's just so paper thin in its execution. Almost every single area and mission has you doing the same thing over and over again, just in different locations. There just isn't much depth here, and it was very clear that the developers had no idea how to adapt the movesets of different wrestlers into this outdoor brawl kind of fighting. Like, no one is around here to see the security guard tap out. This isn't a match that just ends. This is one man who is not trained in wrestling getting destroyed by somebody who weighs 280 pounds. You can't even eliminate opponents using submissions either because you have to more often than not finish them by throwing them off of something else. At the end of the day, you're just going to be left with this really repetitive game that could have been really cool, but in execution pales in comparison to the other wrestling games on the GameCube. You're better off playing one of those instead.
I don't think I'm as harsh on Wrestlemania 19 as a lot of people are, but that doesn't mean that this game is fantastic. In fact, it's just kind of a shakeup of the formula that doesn't really work out. If you play it, you'll probably have some fun, especially if you play along with friends, just to see how blown their minds are.
I think it was pretty courageous of the developers to put the conception of this game right on the cover of the box with Hulk Hogan taking a painful dump on the concept of good video games. The Xbox had a history of getting some mediocre wrestling games, especially from the WWE, which means I had some pretty poor wrestling games to play. Even the most well-received games on the console didn't really compare to the PS2 counterparts. However, Legends of Wrestling scrapes the bottom of the barrel as some of the worst cross-platform wrestling trash on this list. What's sad is the cast of wrestlers does a really deep dive into some serious wrestling history, but the game doesn't give these all-time greats a game that matches the quality of its roster. There are wrestlers in here who I wouldn't have ever known about otherwise, and it's refreshing to see a game with some new faces other than The Rock. There are a few weird additions like Rob Van Dam, a wrestler whose career wouldn't wind down until years later. The problem with Legends of Wrestling, in my opinion, is that the game feels really hollow. There's a delay between when you press a button and when the command actually registers, and even when the moves do make contact, they aren't satisfying on impact. The wrestlers you play as are also weirdly stylized too and look like pumped up versions of themselves. Not pumped up as in muscular, I mean pumped up full of air. They look like toys. That wouldn't be an issue if the gameplay matched the exaggerated art style like WWE All-Stars, but it doesn't. Legends of Wrestling is gravely lacking in basically every category outside of wrestlers. There are a few match types, a handful of generic arenas to wrestle in, and all of the art in the game looks like it was ripped out of a clip art archive. I'm not sure if this is a known issue or if my disc is just defective, but there's this bug that I relate to this game where at some point in playing there is an audio driver crash and this noise repeats eternally until you turn the console off. However, Legends of Wrestling has an edge over WCW Nitro because unlike Nitro, you can actually get moves off, no matter how unsatisfying they are.
Legends of Wrestling barely scrapes by the bottom of the list, coming in at third to last. While the game is clearly flawed, the game has a redeemable roster of characters, especially if you're looking for a game that dives deep into wrestling history. But outside of that, I can't really recommend playing it too much.
To further add to the pile of trash Xbox wrestling games, here comes Wrestlemania 21, a game that looks good on paper and burns said paper upon actually playing it. Wrestlemania 21 replaced the Raw series of games on the Xbox and boasted better graphics, voice-acted cutscenes in the story mode, and a game engine that was built from the ground up rather than iterating on the existing one. Unfortunately, the gameplay was unbelievably bad because the collision detection on characters was downright terrible. Successfully diving onto a downed, unmoving opponent is a roll of the dice because maybe you'll hit them, and maybe you won't. Your wrestler will simply miss. Then, once you miss an opponent, you have to button mash to get back up. It's like your character was hit by a bus. The game is also marred with tons of bugs and glitches that prevent the game from feeling great when things are going well, and a lot of the specialty matches have elements that slow things down considerably, not in game speed, but because they're designed to be slow for some reason. There was also some controversy with the game upon release because Microsoft put the wrong version of the game onto discs, which prevented many players from being able to use Xbox Live with the game. This required a post-launch patch which wiped out created wrestlers, making players create new ones in order to play online. This is really bad for one main reason: the story mode. The story mode in Wrestlemania 21 requires you to build a wrestler from scratch and take him from local zero doing house shows to hero headlining Wrestlemania 21. Wiping your data means creating a new wrestler. Obviously that doesn't really mean anything to anyone in 2020 where Xbox Live on the original Xbox doesn't really exist anymore. But can you imagine how frustrating that must have been? Anyway, about the story mode itself. Your created superstar always ends up looking very mediocre compared to the real superstars you face off against. Some better quality creative modes would have helped that, but it's very limited. You also start off supremely weak, which makes the already frustrating gameplay that much more frustrating because the odds are stacked against you even more. Because missing a dive on a downed opponent normally sucks, but when you're a created character, it's a death sentence. The story mode itself is alright, but the problem comes down to actually having the drive to play the game. I finished the story as a kid by some sheer act of will, and in today's world, I can't even imagine trying to climb that hill again.
WrestleMania 21 tried to renew the hopes of a good Xbox wrestling game, and somehow they ended up doing more of the same while also trying a lot harder. This isn't a very good game, and frankly, it's not worth your time.
It all comes down to this. 2 men, 1 grudge, and the granddaddy of sports entertainment, WrestleMania.
We already talked about the golden age of Smackdown vs. Raw, but let's take a look at its fall. While I really did purchase every single Smackdown vs. Raw game that came out from 2006 to 2011, 2008 was where I really started to lose interest, and 2009 was the nail in the Undertaker's coffin. The reason I lump these games together is because I kind of attribute the descent of the series to these two, but first let's talk about 08. Smackdown vs. Raw 2008 tried to shoehorn the ECW revival into the game when in reality, WWE didn't even take the show seriously enough to begin with. And sure, while it was awesome having a ton of ECW legends return, the gameplay that came along with it didn't do much to flesh out the engine and set it apart from the many upgrades and changes present in 2005, 2006, and 2007. Hardcore matches were refined with the addition of the weapon wheel for when you're reaching under the apron for something to smack someone with, and you could light a variety of weapons on fire. But the problem was, these various weapons didn't really feel substantial from one another, and throwing someone through a flaming table loses its luster when you've done it for the 20th time. The big hook of the gameplay this year was supposed to be the fighting styles assigned to each wrestler. However, these are really controversial and didn't mean much in the grand scheme of things. Additionally, the season mode and general manager mode were bundled together into one 24/7 mode where you either played as a wrestler or a general manager. As a wrestler, you tried to become a legend, and as general manager, you tried to beat the other shows to be the best promotion in the company. Season mode was a series staple by this point, and it needed some life to keep it up from being the same old thing as before. 24/7 mode allowed you to manage your superstar's time outside of the ring by choosing to train, relax, or promote yourself in a variety of ways, but it didn't do much to enhance the experience. The general manager side of things didn't do much either, and was about to be scrapped entirely next year. ECW was a cool addition because it took the competition from 2 shows to 3, but the problem was choosing ECW as your promotion made it nearly impossible to win. The show didn't even have tag team title belts, so you only ever had one championship at a time, whereas SmackDown and Raw have heavyweight belts, tag belts, and a cruiserweight or diva belt respectively. Much like ECW's run as a WWE brand, SmackDown vs. Raw 2008 felt criminally mismanaged. In fact, most of the features that it brought, like the 24/7 mode and fighting styles, were scrapped and changed in later entries.
Smackdown vs. Raw 2008 felt like a cheapened experience compared to the other games that came in the series before it. While you can have some fun with the game, it's not the best place to go if you're just getting into the Smackdown vs. Raw series, and I'd probably recommend playing a different one.
Like I mentioned previously, 2009 was the last WWE game I spent a ton of time with, but by the time I was done with it, I had very little desire to go back. While ECW was still somewhat featured after being a selling point in 2008, the banner feature this year was the refined emphasis on tag teams, something I couldn't care less about. In real-life wrestling on TV, tag teams and stables have the potential to be awesome teams who work together and in tandem to dismantle their opponents because they're on the same page and have chemistry. In wrestling video games, tag matches are a chore. Try to pin, get kicked in the back, try again, get kicked again. In real life, the team works together long enough to keep both opponents isolated to get the pin, but in video games they have a tendency to make you do all the work yourself if you aren't playing with a friend. It's not fun, and it always feels way less interesting than any other kind of match, in my humble opinion. In SmackDown vs. Raw 2009, a lot of my issues with tag matches still remained, and it seemed like most of the effort was put into tag team entrances and finishers. As such, this didn't really appeal to me and it left me wanting more out of the game. The biggest tag team gameplay tweak is the hot tag, and if you're a wrestler, it's such a necessary part of the tag team experience that emphasizes the importance of a team on the same page. On the individual wrestler side of things, the fighting styles are gone and replaced by specific abilities. These attributes are based on if the wrestler is clean or dirty in their approach, not hygiene, and what kind of moves they already do in real life. For instance, a heel superstar can get the ability to take the padding off turnbuckles to deal more damage to Irish Whipped opponents, and a wrestler like Shawn Michaels can do his signature kip up to get a momentum boost. There are 21 different abilities you can unlock for your created wrestlers, and each of the WWE superstars is equipped with 6 of them. The main mode of the game took a totally new direction this year as Season Mode was replaced by Road to WrestleMania. In this new mode, you only have a handful of select superstars to choose from, each who have their own specific story that leads to the big show at the end of the year. In previous years, you could choose any wrestler and they would follow the same story no matter who you chose. But in this new mode, you could choose from Undertaker, CM Punk, Chris Jericho, Triple H, John Cena, and also the very confusing tag team of Batista and Rey Mysterio. I realized that Batista and Rey were real-life partners and even briefly held tag team gold, but of all the stables they had, this is the one they went with? While a more focused story for wrestlers was something I could get on board with, I really didn't like the limited number of superstars I could play as. While you could argue that a streamlined wrestling story was better, the fact that I couldn't play as big names like Edge, Shawn Michaels, or even just solo run with Batista made it feel far more restrictive than refined. Additionally, my favorite mode, GM mode, was removed entirely. Still, 2009 was a much better game than the whiff of a year that came before it, and therefore it gets the slight edge in the worth playing category.
In spite of the limited Road to WrestleMania mode, I still think that 2009 is a much more polished experience than the game that came before it with 2008. I actually really enjoyed on second look going back and playing as CM Punk as he tried to put the E back in ECW, and I think it's pretty funny that the company acknowledged that ECW's revival wasn't very extreme, so they put it in the game instead. Overall, you should play this before you play 2008, but I'd still choose other games in the series before you start with this one.
Welcome back to Did You Know Wrestling. Did you know? The beta for WWE 2K20 was released 2 years before mass release, exclusively on the Switch. This honorable mention is so bad it doesn't get on the board at all. WWE 2K18 on the Switch. There is nothing I regret more than not buying a physical release of the game solely so I could sell it and wash my hands of it forever. Instead, it mocks me from my digital library. Watching. Waiting. I bought this game expecting a similar experience to the PSP ports of the Smackdown vs. Raw games that I could play in between classes. I knew it was going to be rough around the edges, but I was not ready for this. It is insulting that this game exists, and it is downright irredeemable that the WWE still sells this for $60, with the Digital Deluxe bundle, which is an oxymoron, for $90. You're buying a game that doesn't even have active servers for full price. 2K18 is a disaster. If Turtles developed video games, they'd consider this game's speed too slow, and it goes even further than that because almost everything about it is entirely broken. The AI logic is terrible, hit detection is unforgivable. Stuff goes flying at seemingly random. The sound and voiceovers are broken and have considerable delays in between lines.
Let's take a moment to talk about Kevin Owens. It's obvious to me that the WWE Universe doesn't appreciate Kevin Owens.
The only redeeming quality in this, which is found in every other 2K wrestling game, is the creation suite. That's it, and even if you make a wrestler you're proud of, the game isn't worth using it in. It's not worth your money, it's not worth your time, it's not worth the 21 gigabytes on your SD card, it's not even worth thinking about as a joke. I've bought many bad games, but I only have one purchase I regret, and that's WWE 2K18.
Well, I think that'll just about slay them all. But what did we learn today? There's a lot of good wrestling games out there, and probably even more that I didn't get to play as a kid that therefore didn't make this list. We've seen the heights of Smackdown vs. Raw 2006 and WCW NWO Revenge, and we've seen the pits that were WCW Nitro and Wrestlemania 21. While I personally think any of the games from here to about here are worth playing in single player, you could really have a night of fun with any of these games. And that's why I think wrestling games are some of the best couch multiplayer games there are, because they're competitive, but no one cares about the final outcome. And to me, that's what makes a good multiplayer game. So thanks for coming with me on my trip down memory lane through my past of wrestling games. While it's been fun to look at the goods and even the bads, there's something that I love about all of these games in particular. But it's funny, we've looked at all of these games, more than a dozen of them in fact, and there's something I feel like I'm missing, something that I missed as a kid, but it always eluded me and intrigued me.